At the same Hebrew Achron Chaviv, we saved among the best for last for our last session of Lox Learn. And before introducing our distinguished guest, I would like to thank everybody that's made it possible. Obviously, all the Bethlehem staff, including Alex and the rabbis, and my partner in non-crime or whatever societal good deeds, Melissa Gear, and Bonnie, and all the committee that has made this possible. So I'm going to introduce Professor Shira Robinson. She's an associate professor of history and international affairs at the George Washington University, where she teaches broadly on the modern Middle East in the 19th and 20th centuries. Her research focuses on Israel-Palestine, and she is the author of Citizens, Strangers, Palestinians, and the Birth of Israel's Liberal Settler State. That was published in 2016 by Stanford University Press. She earned her PhD at Stanford University. She was born to American parents on a kibbutz in northern Israel, was raised in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and she and her family joined Bethlehem in 2020. And she's going to speak about the historical origins of Israel's current government. And it's my great pleasure to welcome her. Thank you. Oh, and one thing. I'm going to make sure that we have time for questions at the end. So we're going to leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end. So we'll have that.
And I may not finish, so you can cut me off when you need to. Depends on how fast I talk. I don't want, if I talk too fast, raise your hand and I'll slow down. Thank you so much. All right, so thank you all for coming and for being here and being willing to listen to me talk about for inviting me to speak about my research. 5 months ago, at the time that Zach asked me to speak to this group, Israeli citizens had just elected the most far-right government in their history. The new ruling coalition espouses a brazenly illiberal agenda that is the most racist, misogynistic, homophobic, and religiously intolerant coalition that the country or government that the country has ever seen. Since then, Israel has witnessed an unprecedented wave of mass protests, as I'm sure you've seen in the news, bringing together hundreds of thousands of Jewish citizens into the streets to prevent the Knesset from passing a series of new laws designed to undermine the independence of the Israeli judiciary. There are a host of reasons why the new government has set its sights on gutting the independence of the Supreme Court, but the central one is this. For the last 3 decades, the High Court has been at the helm of helping at supporting the economic and political liberalization of Israeli society and strengthening the secular nature of that civil society. In a handful of limited cases, the civil rights of Palestinian citizens, who comprise 20% of the population inside the pre-57 border, have also benefited in their quest towards equality, but only in a limited way. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Since the 2000s, the court has become a battleground between the beneficiaries of these rulings and those who feel threatened by them. First, the parties of the Haredim, who by and large want Israel to be governed according to halakha or Jewish law, and have resisted popular calls by the secular liberal mainstream to serve the secular liberal part of the country. The country has turned right to a significant extent over the last 20 years, but they've resisted the popular calls for the Haredim to serve in the military. Then there is the secular pro-settler right, who reject as hypocritical the political and moral distinction that the Zionist left make between settling inside and outside the Green Line, or the 1967 border. They want to formally annex the West Bank, where 5 million Palestinians live without citizenship or any rights. And they worry about the legal and political threat posed by the growing Palestinian middle class in Israel, whose leading civil rights attorneys are behind all of the successful Supreme Court rulings that they've managed to achieve. Finally, there are the religious Zionist parties who embrace the strident territorial maximalism of the more secular settler right, and are also more strident in their anti-Palestinian racism, but who are more messianic in their justification to hold on to Palestinian land, in their justification for holding on to Palestinian land. On the whole, the anti-government protesters identify secular, liberal, or centrist patriots, not Zionist patriots, not as leftists. They count among their ranks the leaders of the current political opposition, the largely secular and largely Ashkenazi middle and upper classes, the upper echelons of the military, and members of the military's most prestigious units, like Air Force pilots. As they see it, the protesters against the judicial reforms, blocking these reforms, or what they call the judicial coup, is the only way to preserve Israel's definition as a Jewish and democratic state. The current government is undermining this definition, they say, by promoting the Jewish character of the state at the expense of its democratic one. Demokratia, or democracy, is their big champ. Leading figures in communal organizations in the Jewish world and the diaspora have echoed the protesters' concerns about the threats to Israeli democracy posed by these judicial reforms. So have the White House, over 90 Democratic congressional representatives, and many political figures in Europe. But the political horizons of the anti-government protesters are not monolithic. Questions about the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, Palestinian rights to self-determination, the status of Palestinians in Israel, and even Zionism itself have come up on the margins of the protest movement. The people inhabiting these margins are raising concerns like this against the backdrop of the ultra-nationalist turn in Israeli society and politics over the last 20 years, since the 2002 Intifada or Palestinian uprising erupted. During this time, over the last 2 decades, the Knesset has passed a battery of laws designed to remove Palestinian citizens from public life and political life, and deprive them of the democratic channels to contest the de facto and de jure discrimination against them, like the Supreme Court or the electoral process. These laws have also targeted their Jewish allies on the left. Outside of the Green Line or Israel's 1949 borders, the Knesset has taken unprecedented steps to annex the already racially segregated West Bank, where over 700,000 Israeli Jews and 3 million stateless Palestinians live under separate and unequal laws and enjoy separate and unequal infrastructure like rights. Legislators have also backed the pulverization and isolation of the Gaza Strip, where for the past 16 years, the army has maintained a deadly and suffocating siege that has imprisoned over 2 million more stateless Palestinians, severely curtailing their access to food, clean work, clean water, and medical care. Protesters on the left are concerned that restoring the judicial status quo will only further legitimate these policies. During the early protests, Palestinian political leaders in Israel, citizens, were invited to speak to the crowds. But when they explained to the organizers in advance that they plan to raise these issues and connect them to the growing threat to democratic rights that Israeli Jews hold dear, and that enable Israel to maintain its standing in the international community, organizers told these would-be speakers that these issues were off limits. Today, the 7 million citizen and non-Indigenous Palestinians, citizen and non-citizen Indigenous Palestinians who live under Israeli rule from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea is equal in size to the number of Israeli Jews. Despite this, the organizers of the protests, the leading organizers, have barred Palestinian speakers from Israel from asking how Israel could be considered a democracy when a majority of those Palestinians, there are 7 million more in the diaspora, but the majority of Palestinians under some form of Israeli rule have been denied citizenship and all other basic civil and human rights for over 50 years. The speakers have been told not to point out that the Knesset had formally renounced Israel's status as a democracy with its passage of the nation-state law in 2018. Some of you may know that the law enshrines the right to self-determination and to settle anywhere in the entirety of the territory that Israel controls as unique or exclusive to the Jewish people, not only in Israel, but everywhere in the world. Jewish activists on the non-Zionist and anti-Zionist left in Israel who have also tried to raise these same questions, and they have also been muzzled, if less brazenly. While some fellow protesters have been curious about their slogans and signs, most have urged what these leftists themselves call the anti-occupation bloc, that now is not the time to address these issues, which are too divisive. Now, instead, is the time to rally around the flag, and many of you may have seen it. huge crowds of people with Israeli flags. It's become the symbol of until very recently, it's become the symbol of the anti-government opposition, but now it's been taken up by the pro-government counter opposition as well. This dynamic has produced a paradox in which the citizens whose lives will be most endangered by the passage of the judicial reforms, Israel's Palestinian minority, have for the most part stayed home. They have kept their distance from the protests because they see the battle between government supporters and opponents as an internal Jewish affair and dispute, one that will not challenge the structures of Jewish privilege or supremacy, as some may call it, that maintains their status as strangers in their land and provides the rationale for the further colonization of Palestinian land on both sides of the Green Line. My focus today is on what kind of democracy Israel is or ever was, particularly in the first 2 decades of independence inside the 1967 borders, or again, the Green Line. In contrast to conventional wisdom in liberal circles here and in Israel, I would argue that Israel has never been and was never intended to be a democratic republic if you define a democratic republic as the state of all its citizens. In this sense, what is at stake here is not the future disposition of the occupied territories or the possibility of a 2-state solution, but rather the legacy of 1948 and even before then, the origins of Zionist settlement in Palestine. Before I continue, I want to acknowledge that for some of you, the questions I am raising and even some of the terminology I am using may bring up very strong feelings. That is okay. This is very hard stuff to talk about for many of us. One of the reasons why it is so hard is that Jews and Palestinians have attachments to very different narratives about the history of the last 120 years. The two groups have had very different experiences with Zionism. As with Palestinians, for many of us, our identities are bound up with these stories. I belong to a loose community of scholars who have spent the last 3 decades trying to close the gap between Palestinian and Jewish narratives about Israel-Palestine. Together, we have used multiple lenses or frameworks of interpretation to make sense of these histories: nationalism, racism, including anti-Semitism, and settler colonialism. Critical to this project is the way our work seeks to de-exceptionalize the story of Jewish and Palestinian nationalism. My own scholarship is rooted in years of archival and field research in Hebrew and in Arabic. In contrast to the old paradigm in the scholarship that treats Palestinian and Israeli histories as separate, my colleagues and I contend that they are inextricably linked and that you cannot understand one without the other. As I explain in my book, this starting point is the only way we can begin to understand the protracted nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the ultra-right turn in Israel. And the only way to do that, I argue, is to recognize that for over a century, the Zionist movement, and since 1948, the state of Israel, has been dogged by an existential dilemma. That dilemma is how to create a modern democratic republic for Jews in a territory that was already and overwhelmingly inhabited by another people. Let me pause. Long before 1948, the leaders of the Yishuv, or the pre-state Jewish settler community in Palestine, agreed that their political project had no meaningful room for the non-Jewish majority already living there. At the start of the 20th century, Jews comprised about 5% of the population, and by the start of the British Mandate in 1920, they comprised about 10%. This understanding that the political project had no meaningful room for the non-Jewish people already living in Palestine, this was as true for the Zionist left as it was for the Zionist right. It was as true for the diplomatic and religious Zionists as it was for the labor Zionists, who dominated the Yishuv and then the Israeli state politically until the 1970s. At the turn of the 20th century, however, the Yishuv lacked the political, economic, and military capabilities to seize the country for themselves. Its leaders spoke about this problem constantly, and even if some did not acknowledge it to outsiders, they all saw the future in zero-sum terms. As David Ben-Gurion, a prominent Labor Party activist who would go on to become the chair of the Histadrut, the Trade Union Federation, and the Haganah during the Israeli War for Independence, and first Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel, said, David Ben-Gurion, in 1918, just after World War I, there is no solution. There is a national question here. We want the country to be ours. Arabs want the country to be theirs. They thus set out to convince the great powers that Palestine should not be democratic until it was considerably more Jewish. During the interwar years, and with the great help of British imperial sponsorship under the League of Nations mandate, the Yishuv developed strategies and built institutions and infrastructure to overcome its weaknesses by working to conquer the land and labor markets for themselves. These campaigns, conquest of land, conquest of labor, are the terms that they used. As part of this process, and also, unfortunately, thanks to the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s, the Yishuv managed to increase the portion of the Jewish population in Palestine from less than 1/10 of the population in 1920 to 1/3 of the total in 1945. They did so against the vigorous protestations of the indigenous Arab majority in Palestine, who, since the early 20th century, had accurately predicted that the success of the Zionist project was predicated on their own dispossession. The Palestinian political and intellectual elites campaigned throughout the interwar period to convince the Western world of this fact and its patent injustice. They demanded the immediate independence of the country as a one-man, and probably really just one man, one-vote republic. Imperial racism, and after 1945, Western guilt over not doing enough to save Jews from the Holocaust in Europe, left their calls unheard. As many of you know, in November of 1947, the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution to partition Palestine into two states, one Arab and one Jewish. The resolution was a major achievement for the Yishuv. Can I get a slide here, or?
Oh, now to be set up.
Oh, we're not, oh, okay,
Sorry.
that's totally fine,
Did we miss it?
totally fine. The resolution was a major achievement for the Yishuv, not least because the map was much more generous than it could have been. The resolution proposed, the partition resolution proposed to allocate roughly half of the land of Palestine to the future Jewish state, despite the fact that Palestinian Arabs comprised 2/3 of the population and held more than 90% of its land. Palestinians opposed partition on 3 grounds. 1, the international community did not have the right to determine their political future. Number 2, Palestine belonged to its indigenous inhabitants, regardless of religion. And 3, they should not be made to pay the price for the Holocaust. Outwardly, the Yishuv celebrated this map, but its leaders still had reason to worry. The mismatch between the borders of the partition map and the demographic reality meant that Arab Palestinians would still be slated to constitute close to half of the population in a new Jewish state. This was a particular problem because the resolution stipulated that international recognition of each state, membership in the United Nations, would be predicated on the passage of a constitution that would be required to uphold the property and political, social, and economic rights of each of the state's national minorities. Yishuv leaders knew that Palestinians who had been waging their own movement for self-determination for the previous 3 decades and would not willingly consent to they knew that Palestinians would not willingly consent to their own dispossession. Their large numbers in the future Jewish state, if it was to be a democracy, which it was required to be by the partition resolution, would thus vitiate the entire purpose of the national project. Indeed, in November of 1947, David Ben-Gurion outlined to his colleagues at the Jewish Agency, the main political body of the Zionist movement before 1948, he outlined to his colleagues the danger that this possibility of half the population being Arab would pose. If Israel granted the Arab citizenship, he explained, it would be unable to deport them in the future. Quote, "It is better to expel them than imprison them," he urged. During the 12 months of fighting that followed the UN vote, the Yishuv significantly reduced the political threat posed by this possibility of Palestinians comprising 1/2 of the state by expelling and expanding the flight of the majority of the Arab population who lived within the 78% of Palestine that Israeli forces conquered. Soon thereafter, Israel's nascent government worked to ensure the irreversibility of its sweeping demographic and territorial accomplishments. The government invested significant resources to prevent Palestinian refugees from returning home by militarizing the borders, passing new legislation to expropriate their land and property for exclusive Jewish use, and by financing the settlement of new Jewish immigrants throughout the depopulated countryside. And yet still, a nagging problem remained. While the minority of Palestinian Arabs who had managed to stay put within the state's armistice lines comprised only 15% of the new population of Israel, these Palestinian Arabs held a much larger portion of the country's landmass. This territory included large areas that had been allocated by the United Nations to the future Arab state of Palestine, which never came to be. And many Israeli officials expressed concern that the Arabs living in these areas within the boundaries of the state of Israel would continue to demand their right to self-determination. In other words, they feared irredentism. In early January of 1949, the government thus made two countervailing decisions. One, it reluctantly agreed to grant suffrage to the Palestinians who had managed to stay put in order to strengthen Israel's second bid for membership that was coming up in the next few months. Its first bid for membership had been turned down because it hadn't declared its actual borders, which it still hasn't done actually. I'm just using borders as a substitute for armistice lines. It hadn't acknowledged the right, it hadn't said what it was going to do with Palestinian refugees. It hadn't resolved the status of the Arab minority, and for a host of other reasons. So Israel needed cover for its bid in the for membership of the United Nations. It needed to look like it was setting up the state that the partition resolution called on it to do. Simultaneously, however, just as Israel agreed to grant voting rights to the Palestinians who managed to remain, it set out to gut the power of their vote. One of the government's first moves to this end was to institutionalize a military regime that restricted Palestinian movement and employment in order to colonize their land, protect Jewish labor, and uphold Jewish-Arab segregation while denying the Palestinians the basic civil rights enjoyed by Jews to contest this process through political and legal means. A second move, led personally by Prime Minister and Defense Minister David Ben-Gurion, was to delay any Knesset discussion on a citizenship bill until the government could figure out how to avoid enshrining Arab Jewish equality into law. For this reason, because it seemed very difficult to draft a citizenship bill that would figure out how to avoid enshrining Arab Jewish equality into law. For this reason, Ben-Gurion rejected the first 17 proposals from the Knesset Constitutional Committee designed to come up with a draft. For the same reason, the government also politely buried the effort to promulgate a constitution. Many of you may ask, what about the Declaration of Independence and the promise for equal rights and full citizenship? It turns out that the oft-touted pledge to equal citizenship in the Declaration of Independence posed no obstacles in this regard. In December of 1948, the High Court ruled against an Arab claimant whose lands had been seized during the war and said that the declaration was merely declarative and carried no judicial weight. The deadlock over the draft citizenship law broke only in the spring of 1950, when a new bill was offered a workaround to the problem. The idea behind the law of return was to create a separate legal status that superseded the status of citizen, one which would clarify the rights of the Jewish people to the state, regardless of where they lived. Rights to the state as opposed to rights merely within the state. The passage of the law of return in early 1950 paved the way for the 1952 citizenship law, which offered formal suffrage and legal status to the rest of the population, i.e. Palestinian Arabs, but only rights within the state, not to it. And they would get citizenship provided they met a range of conditions. I argue in my book that these two laws establish the legal foundations for racial inequality in Israel. Now, in 1966, Israel's military regime was formally dismantled. Its powers were transferred quietly to the police. It was not that the government had ceased to view Palestinian citizens as a potential political threat. Growing numbers of citizens continue to demand the right of return for their compatriots in exile, and the end of Jewish privilege in every sphere of social, economic, and political life. But the government was now confident that it had neutralized the most serious threats to its wartime achievements of 1948. The military regime has successfully facilitated the expropriation of over 80% of Palestinian land inside 48, and left much of the Arab population impoverished, socially marginalized, internally divided, and denied the right to local governance. The military regime acted in full concert with the Shin Bet, the security services who surveilled them, the police who made sure to check their movement permits and detained them or made them pay a fine if they did not have the exact permit showing the exact location and time that they were allowed to go somewhere. The Ministry of Education, which erased Palestinian history from the textbooks and tried to erase the Palestinian identity of Arab children. And the Histadrut, the Trade Union Federation, which Golda Meir called a great colonizing agency, and which the Histadrut denied Palestinian citizens full membership and access to most jobs until 1965. The military regime was also backed by the High Court, for its part, backed the Knesset's efforts to prevent the emergence of independent Palestinian political activity, as opposed to latching themselves on to Zionist parties known as the Arab blocs of various Zionist parties like Mapai, the precursor to Labor. They were allowed to join as equal members one party, and that was two parties. That was the Communist Party, which was vilified by the government, and the Mapam Party, the Labor Zionist Party, that was also very much opposed to the military regime. By the mid-1960s, the authorities viewed any political threat, in other words, by the mid-1960s, the Israeli authorities viewed any political threat posed by Palestinian citizens as containable, and they believed that the state had less visible mechanisms to control them. And I don't have the page right now, but in my book, I present a quote from, I think it was from Moshe Dayan in the Knesset, saying that this was the least dangerous decision that, in terms of Israeli security, that the state could ever make, was to dismantle military rule. The question of demography and democracy would be rekindled 6 months after the military regime was dismantled in June of 1967. Israeli Jews and politicians, led by the Labor Party at this time, wanted to hold on to the land, but the circumstances of the new occupation were different. Unlike in 1948, most of the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza stayed put, and this was also the era of the rise of the PLO, and they had more. There was more support and more confidence that the Palestinians might be able to liberate themselves from Israeli occupation on both sides of the Green Line. For this reason, Israel refused, unlike in 1948, Israel refused to extend citizenship to the newly occupied 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, while insisting, as per the UN Resolution 242, while insisting that the occupation was temporary. They quickly set up shop, and they established a bureaucratic, military, and administrative and legal military regime using much of the same laws and personnel and institutions that they had used inside the 1948 lines. Settlement under the Labor Party began immediately, and there was a political consensus among all members of the Israeli government that Israel would never allow for a Palestinian state to be established. But the gradual erasure of the Green Line over the course of the 1970s and especially the 1980s and 90s, and since then, would reveal the unsustainable myth that there ever was a democracy on one side of the 1948 lines and the temporary suspension of democracy on the other. In the meantime, in other words, the settlement of Jewish citizens in the West Bank and Gaza until they withdrew in 2005, erased the green line and made it more obvious what Israel had been, what the Labor government had hoped to avoid, which was to make it easier for the world and the Palestinians in particular to cry foul and argue that what was happening here was apartheid, that the Israeli government was never going to withdraw. And I can tell you that from my own research, I found quotes by people like Moshe Dayan, who became kind of the macher of the occupation, the main head of operations when it came to the Palestinian population after 1967. People like Moshe Dayan explicitly said, unlike in 1948, the world is watching us. There are televisions that are in the news is criticizing apartheid policies in South Africa, and we need to make things look easier on the Palestinians than they look for Black South Africans. So they did things like open the borders with Jordan and allow Palestinian civil servants who had been working in Jordan, which annexed the West Bank in 1948, to continue to earn their wages and maintain the Jordanian currency. And secondly, very different from 1948 and military rule, they opened up the labor market of the Israeli labor market in 1948 Israel to Palestinians in the occupied West Bank, in part to make them quiescent when it came to the confiscation of their land, but also to create a relationship of dependency between occupied Palestinians and Israeli society. Most of the Palestinian laborers which went into work on a daily basis in Israel were construction workers, service providers, and things like this. So settlement began immediately, first on the outer limits of the original border between Israel and the West Bank, on the west, and to the east on the border with Jordan. Over time, there would be more settlements established in the center part of the Central Mountain Ridge of the West Bank, which is where the majority of Palestinians live. In the meantime, the gradual upward mobility and wealth accumulation of Palestinian citizens inside Israel after the end of military rule would lead to their organization of powerful civil rights organizations and political movements that would challenge the pillars of Jewish privilege in the Knesset and in the High Court, and demand that Israel become, once again, a state of all its citizens. Since then, Israeli liberals and centrists have by and large supported, or at least remained silent, as the mechanisms of control have been brought more sharply into focus, the mechanisms of control over the Palestinian minority. For Israeli liberals and centrists, the main bulk of today's protests, separation from the Palestinian people was vital for the maintenance of a Jewish and democratic state, a term that emerged only in 1985 and in a very particular context that I'm happy to explain in the Q&A. This is why supporters of the Oslo process, let me just say one more thing about that. The point was, Israelis did not want to extend political rights to the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, because those Palestinians would vote to upend and dismantle the pillars of Jewish privilege that the state was founded on. This is why supporters of the Oslo process in the mid-1990s, starting in the mid-1990s, want to maintain the smokescreen of the possibility of a two-state solution. For the Israeli secular and religious right, even the pretense of distinguishing between the righteousness of Jewish settlement in one part of the land of Israel, inside the 48 lines, from the non-righteousness of settling in another part of the land of Israel, inside the West Bank. For the Israeli secular and religious right, even this pretense calls into question, they believe that this pretense calls into question the entire Jewish national mission. Barring a brief interregnum of hope in the mid-1990s with the Oslo Accords, Palestinians have been saying the same exact thing since 1967. In other words, that Hebron is no different from Tel Aviv. It's only now, as Jewish Israelis are threatened with the stripping of their own democratic rights, that some people are beginning to listen. That's it.
We have time for questions.
And here's a night.
Oh, here's Mike.
Almost 40.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And Zach, I have at least one question on the Zoom as
Yeah,
well,
so-
so maybe we could switch off between one in the room, one in the Zoom.
And I think Shira and Melissa are gonna like figure out who's asking questions, because I don't see well, so I might ignore somebody unintentionally, so.
Yeah, and if people could say their names, that would be great, because I don't know names.
Hi, I'm Iyar. Can you talk about the involvement of evangelicals in this country in the right-wing government in Israel, please?
Yeah, I'm not super well versed in that topic, but certainly since the 1970s, the American evangelical movement, which is incredibly anti-Semitic, in its general beliefs about rapture and things like that, has been very supportive of Jewish expansionism in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, particularly in the West Bank. And the reason that they support Jewish expansionism in the West Bank and refusal to relinquish the territories it lies in their belief that in order for the Messiah, Jesus, to return, all of the Jews have to be essentially collected into the state of Israel or into the land of Israel in order for rapture to happen. And during rapture, all the Jews go up in smoke, of course. So the evangelical community has worked very closely with the Republican Party in recent decades to support Israeli colonization of the West Bank, and has given a ton of money to NGOs in the United States, in particular, to this end, pro-settlement NGOs, this end.
I have a question from Max Stearns in the Zoom. Go ahead, Max.
First of all, thank you, Professor Robinson. I enjoyed your comments a lot, and the book sounds like one very much worth reading. So my question is, I'll preface it by saying it's a little bit unfair because it goes beyond the scope of your immediate project, but it is a question that I think it's important to grapple with to the extent that your project is intended to persuade folks on what I'll call the other side, the folks who might, sort of reflexively, viscerally be inclined to think that your arguments are somehow counter to the notion of having a democratic state of Israel, or rather one in which Jews are protected at some level. And my comment is this: I think that one of the issues in thinking about democracy is an assumption that people wrongly embrace, that it's a norm, that somehow there's this idyllic image of a democratic nation against which to compare, for example, Israel, maybe the United States, when in fact it's extraordinarily elusive to have a democracy that's not exclusive of significant populations, and that absolutely describes the United States and certainly slavery, but we can go well beyond slavery. There's a really interesting book, you probably are familiar with it, by, I think his name is Daniel Immerwahr, called How to Hide an Empire, in which he goes through the entire history of the United States and it's essentially its role in excluding democratic participation rights, really from early on up to the present. And it's a piece of American history that, frankly, most Americans don't even know about, and yet is vital to understanding the parts of the history that they claim, that people think that they do. And it's simply the case that most countries don't have open arms democracy. And I wonder whether trying to sort of compare Israel to a non-existent ideal norm of democracy, as opposed to starting with the premise that, frankly, that doesn't exist practically anywhere in the world, but still is vital to recognize how Palestinians have been so profoundly disadvantaged by decades-long Israeli policies in ways that are even worse under the present Netanyahu regime, and how this is actually connecting, as I think you quite poignantly point out, with Israelis in different ways now that they're experiencing a breakdown of the democracy in ways that affect them directly. I wonder whether that has more cachet in reaching more broadly to folks who would otherwise be inclined to dismiss a project that looks like, by emphasizing democracy, might so de-emphasize the notion of a state that is a safeguard for Jews as to potentially end the project in a way that matters to them.
I'm not sure I understand the very last point that you made, but let me make some, thank you for your remarks, and I briefly turned to the computer so I could see what you look like. Thank you for that. I like knowing seeing who I'm talking to. Thank you for your comments. Yes, there is no ideal, there's no such thing as an ideal or pure democracy, just as there's no such thing as a pure nation state. Certainly, every country has those who are excluded or who the government tries to exclude. I agree with you fully on that. I think there are there's at least one difference that I can point to, which is that I think that the Israeli government has long touted its legitimacy on the basis of it being a liberal democracy. And when the situation is so stark for half of the population under its control, in terms of getting their basic human needs met, their right not to be kicked off their land and out of their homes, the right to not have their homes be demolished, the right to live a normal life and raise their children without being exposed to without having them be exposed to soldiers on the street every day. That flies in the face of these claims to being a Jewish and democratic state, and the extent to which that language has been embraced by American Jews and by the White House and by most people in Congress is really doing a disservice to the victims of the Israeli government policies. And I think that the other thing is that is concerning to me about the language of the Jewish and democratic state is that it reinforces this fiction that Israel before 1967 was actually a democracy. I think that in the United States, in mainland United States, there was an understanding after the end of slavery that there was an ideal that was largely rejected by many politicians and many white people. There was by and large an ideal that was set to create equal rights for all citizens. We could talk about Native Americans who gained citizenship only in 1924. We can talk about other people. Certainly, Puerto Ricans have identified for decades with the Palestinian national movement because of their desire, each of their desires, as the Puerto Ricans see it, to reject and push off the colonizers that have dispossessed them. So I totally get that, and I love Eberwald's work. But I think that the Israeli case, I mean, on the one hand, Israel is what I study, so that's what I'm talking about. But I think the Israeli case of trying to in which the government and many people in society are constantly trying to legitimate their policies toward the Palestinians by claiming to be democratic is something that is not a unique problem, but a particular problem. I hope that somewhat starts to answer your question.
Hi, Alan Schwartz here. Once upon a time in 1948, there was an honor system. In 1967, there was an agreement, and that has been obscured. But the demographics of the state of Israel, political sort of undercurrents, have been changing all along.
Yeah.
What has accounted? Is it the same thing that has accounted for the blurring of the armistice line and the green line? In other words, an abiding sense that an anti-democratic order that you trace back to Ben Gurion and others of that generation, or do you think that the changing demographics within the state of Israel, Jewish composition has led to the ongoing sort of sliding of the or blurring of the boundaries of the state of Israel?
Okay, great question. Lots of answers. So first of all, the airlifting of the Ethiopian Jewish community and the efforts to bring in the success in bringing in 1 million Soviet immigrants, a large number of whom are not considered Jewish by the religious establishment in Israel. Those were both rooted in the attempt to settle the West Bank and until 2005, the Gaza Strip and the Galilee, which still remains a majority Palestinian region of the country. So the sort of demographic imperative accounts for the increase in the Israeli population. The decrease in the Israeli population relative to the Palestinians it has to do with a lower birth rate in part, and in part emigration of a lot of secular liberal Israelis. And those are the main two reasons: the different birth rate and the emigration of many Israeli Jews, either for political reasons, economic reasons, or cultural reasons. Just people being disenchanted with Zionist dream for a variety of reasons. They don't want their kids being exposed to violence of suicide bombings and Palestinian terrorism. They want their kids to be able to have more liberal economic opportunities. They don't think the education system is very good, and on and on and on. But the immigration of Israeli Jews is largely a middle to upper middle class Ashkenazi phenomenon, in part because poor Jews don't have the means to leave their homes and their country in order to set up shop in an even more expensive country like the United States.
Okay, thank you. I want to say this is very brave work. Thank you for doing this.
Give me your name, sorry.
Sorry, Shira I'm a professor at Johns Hopkins. So
Okay.
my question is about authoritarian regimes. You've been talking about territory and legal claims and civil rights. How much is this affecting your ability as a researcher to get access to these materials? I'm pretty amazed that the government hasn't started. Has it started to crack down on research to these materials, which are so important for telling different stories? Thank you.
That's a great question. Your questions have been so great. So it's a complicated picture. Because I was born in Israel, as Zach explained, I have Israeli citizenship. That means that whenever I enter Israel, I come in on my Israeli passport, and when I want to enter institutions, like physical buildings that have security restrictions, I am let in with ease. Okay, so I can go into the it used to be that I could walk into the archive, this was in the early 2000s, say that I wanted to research, very euphemistically, Arab-Jewish relations, which can be construed as any number of things, and I would get files. There were still many files that were completely censored and not declassified, but I got a lot of police records, for example. I got a lot of documentation from the military archives as well. Those records, in the process of my research, over the course of my research, which was started at the height of the Second Intifada, those records were physically taken from my piles at my desk during that process. And the reason is that an Israeli Jewish researcher named Iyar began to publish some of his findings from the same overall set of documents in the Israeli press, and revealing some of the ways in which the Shin Bet and the Israeli government tried to subjugate the Palestinian citizens of the state. And the archival management and the sort of censorship office at the State Archives started getting really scared, and they started pulling archival folders and files from researchers, literally taking them out of my hands. And even before then, which was when I started my dissertation research, I was doing other research before that, but when I started my dissertation research in the summer of 2000, the summer of 2001, I would find archivists in the reading room come up to me as I was reading documents in Arabic, in this case, radio broadcasts by the Israeli army. That's a whole other conversation. But they would come up to me, they didn't know Arabic, and they would say to me, do these documents pose a threat to national security? And you know, I'm Jewish and I'm Israeli, so they deemed me a trustworthy source to define what national security means. So I would say, no, of course not, and go on.
It's shocking they had no Arab specialists doing that work.
They had Shin Bet officials, secret security officials, not secret, but internal security services working upstairs. And over the course of the period that I was doing my archival research in 2001 and 2002, they would periodically come downstairs to the reading room and check in on the archivists who were helping the researchers and say, this can be declassified, this cannot, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that happened though, after I finished my dissertation research and published my book, was that over the course of the 2010s and over the course of the late 2000s and the 2010s, the Israeli archival administration did two things. It actually closed a huge number of the files that I had worked with personally, not because of me, but because of the damage that they saw that it was causing, not just from me, but from other researchers. And they began to digitize the archival files. And they closed the reading room. And what this means is, if you go into Israel as a researcher and you want to use the archives, you cannot actually physically enter the reading room and you cannot find a list of files. So you don't know what you don't see. You don't know what you don't know. And so it's not like in the old days, I can walk into the Israeli archives and say, oh, I want to see this file, this folder and this box and this, and they would say, okay, this is declassified, this is classified. You can see this, but not this. That list no longer exists. And they have been digitizing the documents that they have in a very slow and very particular way, so as to conceal a lot of the kinds of things that I was finding.
We have two more questions, one here and one online. You have one online?
Yeah, somebody waiting.
Hello, I'm Joe Nathan.
Hi.
Was there ever a time when there was an actual belief within the Israeli government and a two-state solution, or has that always been a fiction?
That has always been a fiction.
Oh.
Well, I mean, I'm happy to elaborate on it at great length, but it's always been
Let's
a.
say you go back to the kind of.
Yeah.
Yes, so Rabin was the Minister of Defense or the Chief of Staff, I can't remember. I think he was the Minister of Defense during the first Intifada, which was the first popular uprising of Palestinians in the West Bank and of the Gaza Strip. It lasted from about 1987 to about 1992. Rabin, as defense minister, told the military to, and it was caught on tape, to break the bones of protesters so that they wouldn't, so Israel wouldn't, so that they wouldn't be able to continue to throw rocks, because that was their weapon of choice. Rabin, at the start of the Oslo process, when it became revealed that there had been a secret channel working itself out in Norway between the PLO and the Israeli government, Rabin said on the day before or after the Declaration of Principles was made, he said, the reason I'm doing this is for security purposes. The reason we're going to allow the creation of the Palestinian Authority within the West Bank, not in all of it, and not to be sovereign, but just to be an authority largely of administrative affairs for Palestinians, like the education system, the school system, the postal system, the census system, census administration, the garbage collection, things like this. The reason I'm allowing so that Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem or the Association for Civil Rights in Israel cannot go into the areas designated for partial control over the Palestinians who live in them, and they won't be able to report on the human rights abuses that are going to continue to take place by Israeli forces, because the Palestinians are going to be more reactionary, and they're not going to allow for any critical press or for any human rights organizations. So he literally said, this is the way that we're going to stop having to police the Palestinians. We're going to have the Palestinians police themselves, so we don't have to. And in one of the maps that I was going to show you, the occupation, the Oslo reconfigured the occupation, and it did not actually lead to the withdrawal of sovereignty and the relinquishment of Israeli sovereignty from any of the Palestinian territories. And it was very clear, the government made very, very clear, despite what people thought, that a state was not on the table. And I can tell, I don't know if there's time, but I can tell a great
There's
story.
one more question that's waiting, so
Okay.
you decide how you want to use the last couple minutes, but there is a question here in the Zoom.
Okay, I'll tell my story if we have time after, because I don't want
Yeah,
to.
why don't we go to the question? Okay, Nick, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Okay, great presentation. My question was, I think you made a good comment with Puerto Rico, how it's a similar situation. It was a territory, similar situation to Palestine. I guess my question is, the subject is something I'm not as familiar with. Where do you stand on the, I guess, like after like the Arab-Israeli conflict, 6-day war, that whatever's going on, like Palestine is kind of like the spoils of war, and it's Israel, like based on like historic wars, has like the authority to do what they want with it. And it, of course, it would be nice if the people were treated better, etc. But does Israel have to make those accommodations? I guess is my question. Like, what is your stance on that?
Okay, another excellent question. So in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the United Nations expanded the definition, expanded the scope of international humanitarian law. And as a result of Hitler's occupation of several countries to its east and its attempt to forcibly settle ethnic Germans in these territories, international humanitarian law was expanded to include the notion that military occupations by force, occupations of territory by force was illegal under international law, and they could therefore only be temporary. After 1967, Israel reluctantly agreed to sign on to, and some of the Arab states reluctantly agreed to sign on to a resolution, UN Security Council resolution known as 242. And that set up the framework of the land from peace notion. What the document actually, the resolution actually said was three things. The acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible. Israel should withdraw from the territories it occupied in the previous war in exchange for recognition and peace. And three, the Palestinian refugees should be helped, basically. So treating the Palestinian, a just settlement of the refugee problem, that was the language. So it treated the Palestinians as a non-political issue. It reinforced the validity of the 1948 conquests. And Israel, there are multiple languages in which UN documents are published. In the case of this resolution, Israel insisted, and the United States went along with this, Israel insisted that the language say that because of international law, Israel will withdraw from territories occupied by Israel in exchange for peace. What Israel meant in doing this was to say, we will withdraw from the territories that we want to withdraw from, and we will determine the borders of our country. Palestinians and the Arab states attached themselves, well, the Palestinians rejected 242 altogether, but the Egypt and Jordan and later Syria accepted only the French version, which said Israel must occupy from the territories. And the reason that the French version used the direct article is because French doesn't allow for de territoire means the with territories. So Israel is
They mean some.
okay. So some. Well,
You're going to say lay or day?
Lay or day.
We'll
Lay-
just that later.
yeah. it's been a long time since I studied French, like not since middle school, but the point is to answer the question, Israel is obliged by international law to withdraw from the territories it occupied by force in 1967, and it has not done so.
Thank you so much for Professor Robinson for your enlightening talk and to all of you for coming. And please take more food and thank you very much for being here.